Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 weird facts about medieval castles. Before we get started with today's video, I will say that it is a collaboration video with Shad from the YouTube channel Shadiversity. If you are interested in this video, interested in things like castles, anything medieval, absolutely go over and check out Shadiversity. There is a link below this video to that channel, and let's get started.
Number 10. The term castle is actually very confusing in the English language. In defining what a castle is, other languages do better. In French, the word chateau means castle, but when referring to a properly fortified castle, it would be called chateau fort. The German language defines a fortified castle as a burg, while a structure that looks like a castle but lacks practical fortifications, such as a manor house, would be a schloss. In English, the historical use of the word castle has been used to refer to fortresses, citadels, manor houses, and palaces, even though these structures can be very distinct from one another. The modern usage of the word castle essentially refers to any building with medieval-style battlements, regardless of if they are functional or aesthetic. But if we want to be more accurate to what castles were in the medieval period, we should try and use the word castle to refer to a building that would have been considered a castle in that time. This means a real castle is a building with functional medieval battlements that could properly protect the occupants inside and provide multiple ways for those occupants to repel attackers. All other castle-like structures should have a prefix to their description, such as a converted castle, Japanese castle, house castle, fantasy castle, or fake castle. Number 9. It was through conquering the local castle that the land was taken from another ruler in medieval times. The feudal system had no state-run military. Instead, the military force of the medieval period was fielded by local lords who had sworn fealty to greater lords who in turn also had their own soldiers. These soldiers were a mix of both men-at-arms and knights. A king could command his lords to rally for war, but generally the individual soldier obeyed his lord before the king, as demonstrated by the many rebellions and uprisings by local lords against their kings throughout the medieval period. This would have been impossible if the state, or king, controlled the whole military. Yet, even though this military was fragmented into different locations under different commanders, they still needed a place to train, maintain themselves and their arms, rest, resupply, and to do all of this in a place that was secure. This place was of course the castle, or the fortified cities of the time, which often had castles within them called citadels, and they served as the medieval soldiers' military base. Any army that had access to such a base near a point of conflict held a profound advantage over an attacking force because they could strike out in skirmishes against a mostly vulnerable aggressor. Once the skirmish was complete, they could retreat back to a very secure location that couldn't be attacked. The attacking army could ransack the surrounding lands, but that didn't deal with the defending army, which would be striking at their flanks as much as possible. Land was the most valuable resource that an attacking army could take, and the land couldn't be permanently taken until the defending army in that land was dealt with, which meant dealing with the castle. Number 8. The most significant defensible feature a castle could receive was through location and not design. Of course, castle design was important, but castles were most useful in strategically important locations. If placed on a steep, high, or secluded hill, the castle could become nearly impregnable through sheer inaccessibility. This is especially true in respect to things like siege towers and trebuchets, as they simply couldn't be used if they couldn't get close enough. There are many historical castles that were placed in such commanding positions that they were never taken by direct assault. Number 7. Contrary to what many people think, it is the gatehouse and not the central keep that was the most important and defended part of a castle's structures. As much as castle design is focused on preventing people from getting in, they still need a primary entrance. This entrance was the weakest part of a castle because it was much easier to get through an entrance that was already there than going to the trouble of forcibly making a new one. This entrance would be as big as needed for carts and wagons and as small as possible to bottleneck any attackers trying to get through. This means those massive gates we see in many medieval fantasy castles are impractical and unrealistic. The larger the gate, the harder it is to defend. A gatehouse would usually have overhanging battlements or flanking towers at its front and a portcullis over the entrance, which is a large wooden grate that would be raised and lowered when needed. Yet these features only frame the bare basics of what could have been added to a medieval gatehouse, because many were as heavily fortified as possible. Heavily fortified gatehouses often had drawbridges, multiple portcullises to trap the enemy inside, and murder holes and arrow slits to attack any attacker passing through. Number 6. The internal walls of castles were not bare stone. The idea that medieval people went around covered in dirt with everything in muted browns and greys couldn't be further from the truth. Medieval people loved color, and the more color you could display in dress and in your home, especially those colors that were hard to fabricate through dyes, the greater wealth was implied. The image that castle interiors were all stone brick is very inaccurate, and the reason people assume this is because the lime-painted whitewashed plaster that covered these walls has worn away over time, leaving bare stone. The people who lived in castles were rich, and they wanted to be seen as rich. One way they did this was to paint the plastered walls and roof of their living spaces with colourful patterns and murals, often very garish to modern standards. Seriously, historical castles were a riot of colours.
Number 5. As a general rule, castles didn't have large windows. The purpose of a castle was not only to keep people out, but to aggressively repel them, and any hole on the outside of a castle that was large enough for a man to fit through would be a very big problem. This meant that most outward-facing castle windows were very thin. The exception to this was windows that were high enough up that it would be extremely difficult or suicidal for an attacker to reach. Also, windows that faced the internal ward or bailey of a castle could also be large because they couldn't be directly assaulted by external attackers. It should be noted that historical castles you can find that have large windows on the outside and near the ground level were retrofitted later. The idea was that these larger windows would make the castle more livable.
Number 4. Castles did have secret entrances and back doors. This back door, called the postern or sallyport, wasn't so much secret as it was small and very easily defended. The postern could be hidden, but it wasn't a big problem if an enemy knew where it was. Unlike the main entrance, the postern didn't need to be large enough for wagons and therefore could have sharp internal corners nullifying access for battering rams or be securely blocked off with metal grates. The postern would usually sit at the base of the castle and was therefore protected by the battlements above. This meant that these back doors would seriously bottleneck any army trying to assault them, which explains why it was rarely ever done. But they could still be a castle's downfall. Several times in history have infiltrators or spies opened the postern to the enemy, such as what happened at the final siege of Corfe Castle in 1645. Number 3. Properly designed castles are much better at their job than many people realize or what is depicted in movies. Films such as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Ironclad, and Kingdom of Heaven show that defeating a castle or castle-like defenses was a simple matter of storming the walls and trebuchets that could destroy castles with a short bombardment. In reality, though, taking a castle was far from a simple matter. Committing to an all-out assault was the most extreme and unlikely option when trying to take a castle, as that option put most of the attackers' men at risk with high chances of them getting killed. Rather, most sieges were slow and considered affairs. Those in the castle weren't going anywhere, and if there was no sign of immediate reinforcements, the attackers could take their time in building barricades, sometimes fully encircling the defending castle with a wooden wall. The size of the trebuchet and the size of the castle wall mattered. If the trebuchet was too small and the castle wall too thick, the bombardment would do negligible damage. But if the trebuchet was big, it could do far more damage. The largest historical trebuchet was called Warwolf and could throw a 90-kilogram projectile over 300 meters. What we need to remember, though, is that the Warwolf was an exception, taking 54 men 3 months to build, and doesn't represent the standard size or effectiveness of most medieval trebuchets. It would also take many hits from a trebuchet to destroy a castle wall, as they were very, very thick. This process could take several days to weeks, especially considering that several hits would be deflected due to the round design of castle towers. Then, even if there was a breach in the castle wall, this was far from a guarantee that the castle would fall. In 1408, English forces under the command of the future king Henry V laid siege to Harlech Castle and bombarded it with cannons. Historians deduce this destroyed the south and east parts of the outer walls, which were later rebuilt, yet even with the damage from cannon fire, and remember that cannons are far more powerful than trebuchets, Harlech only fell when it ran out of supplies and many of its defenders had died of starvation in February of 1409. Against greater numbers, cannons, and even having parts of the castle destroyed, the defenders of Harlech Castle held off the aggressors for nearly a year and only surrendered when they ran out of supplies. So clearly, breaching a castle wall didn't mean the fight was over. This is not to say that castles couldn't be taken or destroyed, because historically many were, only that it was much harder to do than what most people realize. Number 2. The most historically effective way to take a castle was by starving it out. Most castles would have a cistern that would collect rainwater or a well, and depending on how much food was stored, starving a castle wasn't always viable. An approaching army allied to the castle would have also made a lengthy siege impractical and forced the besiegers to be more aggressive, resorting to bombardments and assaults in an attempt to take the castle before the other army arrived. Still, if the army could get away with it, they would simply choose to starve the castle out, as this was a proven strategy with very little risk. An all-out assault, on the other hand, always carried the chance of complete failure and the loss of one's army. Number 1. Castles required far fewer people to defend than people think. An example of this is Harlech Castle standard garrison, which was comprised of only 36 men. Considering that the castle would get besieged by armies numbering in the hundreds to thousands, 36 is a big contrast. Likewise, when Corfe Castle was besieged in 1645, it had only 5 soldiers and a few servants to defend it, yet they held out against an army of 300 before being reinforced. Castles were built to enable those inside them to effectively repel attackers, and when properly designed, they did their job amazingly well. While it's true that the more soldiers the defenders had, the more likely they were to be able to repel an assault, additional men weren't completely necessary. Castle assaults didn't happen right away or very frequently during a siege. Like we've said, sieges were slow and considered affairs that could last months to even years, and therefore the more people in a castle, the more resources they had to consume. This meant that any non-essential resident or servant in the castle would be sent away if a siege was imminent, and it was practical to do so. The castle would only keep those soldiers that it could sustain for an extended period of time.
So I really hope you liked that video. As I mentioned at the top of the video, this was a collaboration with Shad from Shadiversity. If you'd like to check out Shadiversity's channel, absolutely click on one of his videos, which I'm linking to over there on the right, and thank you for watching.